Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, but before we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping. And again, I'm Philip Fine. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer here at South Coast Air Quality Management District in the Planning Division. Please place your phones on silent or vibrate so we're not disturbed. All of you are familiar with this auditorium, but the restrooms are out at the back, on my left, down the hallway, at the very end of the hallway. In case of an emergency, please exit the building through the exit doors at the back of the auditorium that way. If a shelter in place is necessary, like an earthquake, please drop, cover your head, hold on to your chair. All right, so with that, welcome to this public consultation meeting. First, let's do some introductions up here, and then I'll make some opening comments. So again, my name is Philip Fine. We'll start with Sylvia.
Okay. My name is Sylvia Vandersbeck, and I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning Branch at the California Air Resources Board.
Good afternoon. I'm Kirk Carperis. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for the California Air Resources Board.
Hi, I'm Sarah Reese. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in Planning at the District.
Hi, I'm Barbara Baird, Chief Deputy Counsel in the Legal Division at the District.
Hello, I'm Zorik Pirvasian. I'm Planning and Rules Manager with AQMD.
So thanks, and thanks to our partners at the California Air Resources Board for coming down for this important kickoff meeting. So this meeting is serving kind of a couple purposes. One is we have our next cycle of our air quality management plan due in 2022. So this serves as kind of a kickoff for that process, our advisory group. The reason this is not a meeting in the advisory group is our advisory group for the AQMP is board approved, governing board approved. So the previous roster expired. So we're currently in the process, and many of you in the room have already been contacted about continuing a role or being added to that roster for our AQMP advisory group. But until the board officially approves that, we're going to have public consultation meetings. So that's what this is. But it is essentially getting back together for the next cycle of the AQMP. And even though this is being held in the auditorium, I'd like to kind of have this meeting be a little more free-flowing, like a working group, like an advisory group. So we don't need, if you fill out a card, that's great. We have your contact info, and we can answer questions that are submitted online like we do for workshops. But also, we're all fine with Q&A and an open discussion to the extent we can in a forum like an auditorium. Although it's a kickoff for the 2022 AQMP cycle, as many of you know, there are other state implementation plan or air quality management plan obligations that are going to come due before that 2022 AQMP is due. And what we're going to kind of focus on today is one of those earlier obligations, and this is a big one. Many of you are aware of this. So we're going to talk kind of as a kickoff generally about the challenges that we face, not just generally with air quality, but the specific submittal we owe EPA by the end of the year. And it's going to be a challenge, and we need to work with the advisory group, our partners at the California Air Resources Board, US EPA, to figure this out together, how we're going to put this submittal together and hopefully get approval from EPA. So with that, we're going to, Sarah in a moment is going to give kind of the presentation, give you the background and what we're facing. But before we do that, I wanted to give my counterpart at California Air Resources Board, Mr. Carperis, a chance to say a few words.
Thank you, Phil. And again, thank you for the opportunity to come here, and good afternoon to all. The first thing I want to do is compliment the district on your camera system. I look younger on this camera than I do in the CARB system. I'm not saying you're better than us, but I have no gray hair in that picture. I really like it. So as Phil said, the submittal that's due the end of this year is going to be a challenge for all of us collectively to put together. I'm actually, though, however, quite confident. The momentum that was established putting through the 2016 AQMP was the most collaborative and the most productive in my 20-plus years of experience at the time in putting together SIPs. And I think it was in large part due to the professionalism of Phil and his leadership at the district. We are absolutely committed, CARB is absolutely committed to stand shoulder to shoulder and do our part to ensure that the submittal that we produce at the end of this year will move the region forward toward attainment of the standards, and we will do our darnest to meet the requirements of EPA. It will be a challenge, but we will do our darnest.
All right, thanks, Kurt. So Sarah will give a brief presentation, then we'll open it up. So take it away, Sarah.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So again, my name is Sarah Reese. I'm an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in the Planning Division here at the district. Part of what I do is work on the AQMP, and so today I'm going to give you just some more background information on the progress we've made in meeting our goals, and then also some of the challenges we have facing us ahead. So just a quick outline of what I'm going to cover. First, going over some very basic background, talk a little bit about some of the items that we had in our 2016 Air Quality Management Plan, progress that we've made to date, a little bit about this Clean Air Act 182E5 measures, which is a very kind of technical term, but it'll be more clear as I go through what that is. The role of federal sources in our decisions, and when I mean federal sources, these are sources that we don't have regulatory authority over, either at the district level or at the state level. Our proposed contingency measure action plan, and then next steps moving forward. This just gives you an overview of our upcoming deadlines to meet the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. So those are the federal air quality standards that we have to hit. You can see that we have some deadlines that are coming up fairly quickly. 2022 is for the 79, the old 1-hour ozone standard. The one that's really of concern and driving a lot of this work, though, is the 1997 8-hour standard. That one has a deadline coming up in 2023, and that's the one that's really most challenging for us to attain in the short term. Gives you a quick overview of where we are in terms of ozone trends and what that looks like over time. And you can see we've made a fair amount of progress. The levels have definitely been coming down. This is both on the annual level, so annual averages, as when it's what our design values look like. You can see over the last couple of years there has been a little bit of an uptick. We're still looking at that to investigate what exactly is going on. We know we've had a lot more hot weather in our summers, a lot more periods of stagnant air. Those are conditions that contribute ideally to the formation of ozone. So we're still looking and investigating that, but I think the message here is we have been making significant progress towards our goals. And again, this is reflected when you look at our trends in emissions. So this is our emission inventory for NOx and VOC emissions, which are two precursor emissions important for the formation of ozone, been going down dramatically. And then you can see emissions on measured NO2 concentration has also been falling. So in terms of progress in NOx emission reduction since 1997, we have made a lot of progress. You can see the bar in the red color, and that's sort of the deficit that we need to make up. So what we have here is showing how much we expect to get from our air quality management plan in terms of getting down to the NOx emissions that we need. The blue bar, our 2023 carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is just the amount of emissions that we can have in our basin and still be able to meet our federal air quality standards. So that's the level that we need to get down to. You can see that we've made a lot of progress for our yellow bar, what we got in down to the 2023 baseline, but there's still a little bit of a delta that we need to make up, and that's in that red bar. NOx is definitely the most efficient way for us to get to our ozone goals. I mentioned before that both VOCs and NOx contribute to ozone formation, but we're in a regime where we are NOx limited, and it's a little bit of a complicated chart, but you can see with these isopleths, with the 80 ppb level, which is the level that we're trying to get down to, you can make far more progress with NOx emission reductions than you can with VOC emission reductions. And so the blue line that we have illustrated on this chart, that indicates where our control strategy needs to go under our 2016 AQMP to meet the level. And what that really shows is that we have to get fairly dramatic reductions in NOx emissions in the short term. We project that we need to reduce NOx by 45% over what we already have existing in place in order to meet our goals in 2023. In terms of where all of our NOx is coming from in 2023, it shows a picture that's still dominated by mobile sources. So ocean-going vessels and harbor craft are a big source. We have our trucks as well. You can see that stationary sources are a contributor, but it's fairly minor in the scheme of things when you compare them to mobile source emissions. And this is just a chart that breaks out more what our top categories look like, both in 2012 and 2023 projected. You can see that we've been making, and we expect a lot of progress in emission reductions from heavy-duty trucks, from some of the other on-road sources. That's because we're having some rules that are coming into effect that will get cleaner trucks on the roads and be able to get reductions from those. But then you can still see that there's some source categories that are staying the same, notably ships and commercial boats. That's a category that's actually we project to increase over time. So our 2016 AQMP showing our control strategy for NOx. I apologize, it's a little bit of a complicated bar chart, but just shows the different measures we have, both the measures that we as South Coast Air Quality Management District has for our stationary sources, mobile sources, and different incentive components. And then there's also measures that CARB has because they have different regulatory authority that they can pull on, again, for mobile sources, for consumer products, other incentive components. And then we have this category called further deployment of technologies measures. This is something that we're able to put in the plan under the Clean Air Act, where we don't exactly know how we're going to get those emission reductions, but we know that there's technologies that are developing and that we expect them to be in place and be able to be deployed to be able to meet that deficit. So this is the section that I was mentioning before, Section 182E5. It's a section of the Clean Air Act that's applicable for extreme areas of non-attainment, which we are, and it allows for agencies to point to anticipated development of new control technologies when you're developing your plans. But when you do rely on those sections, you then have to provide contingency measures 3 years before the implementation date. So for us, it's 3 years before the 2023 attainment date. So at that point, you have to provide full reductions were assigned to the 182E5 measures, and you should also include measures that you've already adopted. So that's the work that we're looking into doing right now. In our 2016 AQMP, we did have further deployment of cleaner technologies measures. We used that provision. These are both for new federal and state regulatory actions that we knew were coming along. Also looking at different system efficiencies, if there's some local authority or measures we can take. So for example, the facility-based measures work that we're doing qualifies for this. And then also looking at incentives programs and relying on incentives to really accelerate deployment of cleaner technologies and do that faster than what we can get through regulatory measures. It's kind of explaining more what our further deployment measures look like. So you can see that we were looking at 108 tons per day for further deployment measures. That's broken out on the various source categories for on-road, locomotive, aircraft, off-road equipment, ocean-going vessels, and then on-road heavy-duty. So it's a fairly wide variety of sources. We have relied on 182E5 measures in previous air quality management plans. You can see that our reliance is less than what it's been in the past. So the comparison of what we had in our 2007 AQMP versus 2016, but 108 tons per day is still a fairly significant chunk. And this is just an evolution of how we've characterized those measures when we've described them in our plan. And you can see that we have a lot more specificity than what we had in 2007. So, for example, technologies that are under development that are getting there, but they just require additional commercialization. So that would be zero-emission trucks. Looking at technologies that are here today and commercially available, but just getting them out more. being able to have new emission standards in place, and then having those standards take effect and accelerating deployment of vehicles or vessels for those standards. So we have a bit more specificity to what we have, but there's still that element of things that need to be developed. We have also developed some rules that have contributed to NOx emissions reductions since 2016. So this is just a listing of those rules that we've been able to adopt. That has gotten us 5 tons of emission reductions per day. So not gigantic, but it's still, we're making progress in that area. But again, I think it's important to remember that the lion's share of the NOx emissions in our basin, they're coming from the mobile sources. So these are rules that apply to stationary sources. Get emission reductions from that sector is still very important, but it's not going to be sufficient in and of itself to get us to where we need to be. We have had a good track record in terms of implementation of incentive programs and to be able to see success there. So CARB program is probably the most well-known of our incentive programs that we administer. And so that's just a way of getting funds out to accelerate the turnover of vehicle fleets and get cleaner engines and vehicles in our basin. We've deployed significant funds on that since 1998. I won't read off the stats, but you can see that it's a lot of money has gone through this. Similarly with Prop 1B, that's a program that's been in place since 2009, and again, a very significant deployment of incentive funds. And then other incentive programs that we have the Replace Your Ride program, which is specific for light-duty vehicles, and has been able to turn over 3,000 vehicles since its inception. And then programs looking at school bus emissions and getting cleaner school buses in our fleets. CARB has also adopted rules aimed at NOx reductions since the 2016 AQMP. And so we had I have a table here comparing what we expected in our 2016 AQMP and what we continue to expect to get out of these rules versus what these rules as adopted have currently achieved to date. And so you can see we have a variety of incentive programs that we have in place. CARB we still need to quantify what we think we'll get out of the zero emission airport shuttle buses rule and the lower in-use emission performance standard rule. But we are still getting some emission reductions from the CARB rules. But this chart just shows you a trend on emission reductions from NOx from light-duty vehicles over time. We were joking that these little symbols you see on the chart are like little turtles or, I don't know, something else. But it shows you the different programs when they come into play and how they have resulted in emission reductions from the light-duty vehicle sector. So there's been a variety of programs in place that have really been able to get very significant emission reductions from light-duty vehicles for NOx. And similarly, we have the trends here for heavy-duty vehicles. Heavy-duty vehicles are a much bigger contributor of NOx emissions in our basin. But again, a variety of incentive programs and rules that have been in place to be able to reduce those emissions as well. And then this is a chart that shows our progress on off-road equipment. A similar scale of emission reductions we've been able to achieve, again, through a variety of incentive programs and different rules that have come into play over time. So this chart is important because it indicates the contribution of federal sources to our NOx emissions in 2023. And it's a fairly significant chunk. It's 32%, so about a third of what the emissions are that we have. It's important because these are sources that we don't have direct regulatory control over. You can see that ocean-going vessels are the biggest chunk of that piece. And then we also have some from on-road mobile sources as well as trains and aircraft. And so this is a chart showing the progress on NOx emissions that we expect from ocean-going vessels over time. There have been some programs in place, some incentive programs. Our ports have instituted vessel speed reduction programs, which get significant NOx emission reductions. These vessels, their emissions are regulated under international law, so under the International Maritime Organization. They've developed a standard that took effect in 2016, but for a variety of reasons, we don't expect that emission standard or those new vessels are going to come to our ports in mass quantities anytime soon. And so we're actually projecting that emissions from ocean-going vessels for NOx are going to go up over time. NOx emissions trend for locomotives. Again, a number of programs are in place. We do expect that those emissions will be declining over time, not quite to the scale of what we're getting from the mobile sources that we control, that we have more authority over, but still having a reduction. And then aircraft. Aircraft, note there are no programs in place on aircraft emission controls. We do expect that those emissions are going to go up over time. Again, aircraft, they're regulated at an international level for the emission standards, and there's also a variety of federal rules and requirements in place that restrict what we're able to do in terms of reducing those emissions. So what are we doing on federal sources if we don't have direct regulatory control? So one way we really reach at them is to leverage our ongoing incentive programs where we're able to provide funds to encourage the turnover of the fleets, to get cleaner trucks and engines out there. CARB does have some regulations in place that are helping. So they're at-berth regulation, which they have in place and are currently in the process of revising, which will get NOx emission reductions from ships that are docked. There's also OGV, low sulfur fuel standard, which gets us some emission reductions. And then on intrastate locomotive, CARB has a diesel fuel rule. Our district has petitioned EPA as well as CARB. We've petitioned EPA to develop new heavy-duty emission standards for trucks. EPA has responded affirmatively to that petition, and they're in the process of developing that rule, but we don't know what that rule is going to look like, and EPA is still pretty far away from being able to put that rule or able to finalize that rule. Even if they were able to finalize that rule in the short term, under the Clean Air Act, there's about a 4-year delay in model year before those standards could take effect. So while it's great that EPA is working on that rule, it's probably going to be too late for our deadlines. CARB has also petitioned EPA on developing a locomotive standard. EPA has so far declined to respond to that petition. And then we also are looking at developing new incentive programs. We know that emissions from ocean-going vessels are pretty significant, and so figuring out what we can do in our power to be able to encourage cleaner vessels to call at our ports. We've been having discussions with ports and other entities across the Pacific Rim and in Asia, where they also share air quality issues that are influenced by ocean-going vessels, to see if there's some joint collaborations and incentive programs we could put in place that would really encourage the visits by those cleaner vessels. And then we're also investing in some technology demonstration projects to see if there's some retrofit technologies that could be used to get cleaner emissions from vessels. And then, of course, we have our program and our regulations on stationary sources that we still continue to implement. So we have several kind of ongoing near zero and zero emission technology deployments and developments. Just some examples of projects that we have going on. It's an exciting time where there's a lot of new technology being developed, and we know is either getting very close to being deployed or deployable today. And we know that we're still going to be able to make significant progress on our trucks and get those emissions down through that. I won't read off all of the details of this, but you can see that it's some very promising technology for us. So given that incentive funds have been very helpful in allowing us to promote cleaner vehicles and get turnover of the fleet, that's a very big part of what we had as part of our 2016 AQMP. At that point, we predicted we needed about $1 billion a year over a 14-year period in incentive funds to be able to reach our goals. We're likely looking at revising that effort or revising that number, and it will be more funds that we need in order to be able to hit our goals. There's a number of sources of funding where we expect future funding that we'll be able to deploy, but that's about $210 to $240 million per year, short of that $1 billion a year figure, so there's still a way we need to go. So we are looking at methods for getting additional funding. We have our voter district authorization legislation that's pending. We're looking to the federal government to see if there's other federal funding mechanisms available, and then any other way where we can secure funds that we're able to deploy and get cleaner vehicles and engines. The development of our proposed contingency measure plan. So in developing that plan, we have to go through and account where we've gotten NOx emission reductions to date. So looking at whatever measures that we've adopted or CARB has adopted since the last AQMP, looking at proposed measures and programs that we expect to be adopted by the end of this year or early 2020. And then also looking at incentive measures that we have funded to date and being able to quantify emission reductions associated with that. We then look at additional reductions that we expect from anticipated sources of funding, so funds that we don't already have today, but we're fairly sure we're going to get. And then we have to look at what's left over, what's the balance, what's the deficit, what is the contribution of federal sources to that deficit, and what's their responsibility. And then also looking at if there are other measures for additional regulatory actions that we could take, additional funding, et cetera. But this plan is due to EPA the end of this year, so it's coming up fairly quick. In terms of our public process and next steps, we're having a public consultation meeting today. We're looking for your comments on proposed contingency measure development. To the extent you have email comments, please send them to us. We're very willing to hear and want to hear your feedback on all of this. We are looking at initiating our air quality management plan advisory group meetings, starting those back up in September. We will be releasing our draft SIP update staff reports to the public in October of this year, then conducting workshops throughout our 4 counties in October again, and then looking at our board adopting this plan in December of 2019 in time for our submittal to EPA. You can see through all of this, these dates are running together. The schedule is fairly tight, so we have a lot of work ahead of us to be able to move forward and meet this deadline. And then following our board's adoption of the plan, CARB, this would be submitted to CARB, and then CARB would, board would adopt the plan and then submit it on to EPA. So with that, I think we'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sarah. And the one point that Sarah made right at the end there is the technical deadline for this submittal. Technical deadline for the submittal is the end of this year, but we're committed to take as long as we need to have the full public process. We were a couple months late on the last submittal of the AQMP. The implications are not severe for being a couple months late, but we're going to try to shoot for December, but if through the public process we need more time to craft this, I think we have a little bit of flexibility on that. And we'll just see how it goes, and we'll adjust the schedule as necessary. Okay, so with that, I'd like to open up to questions. Do we have cards, or how do we? So we'll start with the cards. Well, there'll be plenty of opportunities. We don't have cards yet, so I'll just show of hands. I'll call somebody up to the mic, and we'll have a discussion. So, well, I have one card at least. We'll start with that. So Yvonne Watson.
Also wanted to mention that people who are following us on webcast, you can submit your comments or questions to AQMP team at aqmd.gov, and we'd be happy to respond to your questions. Thank you.
For the Sierra Club Angeles chapter. Let me repeat that. My name is Yvonne Martinez-Watson. I'm the chair of the Environmental Justice Committee for the Sierra Club's Angeles chapter. I have a few talking points here that I just want to go over real quickly. But before I get to that, I just want to say this implementation that we are thinking about doing is very personal for me. You haven't seen me here for quite a while. And that's because I've been in and out of the hospital. I've been diagnosed with severe asthma, And when I started looking at the charts, this is the first time I've seen them in this paper that was handed out to us, my problem started getting worse right in about 2017 when we had that uptick. And they've just gotten worse. So again, this is highly personal for me because I cannot tolerate high ozone levels. And I am constantly using the AQMD's website to plan what I do every day now, because I actually have a mask in my bag right now that I use. My general comment is that we need to come out with much stronger regulations, because we were doing so well, and now we're having a little bit of what you call an uptick. And for people like me, we're running out of time. We already know what the statistics are, that thousands of people every year are dying from pollution-related asthma events. And I almost became one of those statistics this year. It was that serious. I ended up in the hospital in the ICU for 2.5 days, unconscious on a ventilator machine. So, like I said, this is highly personal. We don't have time. So what I will say from the talking points I was given, near zero emissions, we don't have time for that anymore. We should just go to zero emissions. We really don't have time for the near zero, because we're starting to run out of time as far as the tipping point for climate change. And again, for people like myself, I don't know if I'm ever going to be here next year. But I'm thinking about the children that are younger than me, the young adults who are younger than me. So please, if we could somehow focus on zero emissions, that would be better. I think you're going to be getting more extensive comments from Sierra Club via email, so I'm not going to really focus on those right now. I just really wanted to focus on the fact that this is hitting people of color the hardest right now. And it's not fair, because we are not the ones generating the pollution. We are the ones suffering from it. So please, if you can, make sure that this is an environmental justice issue, and we need to do better, because we've had a long time to try to make these deadlines and all these milestones that we need to make, and we have not been meeting those deadlines, and we have not been making those milestones that we need to make. And now the time is running out. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne, for those comments. Those are great comments. Again, I'll address some of those and maybe clarify. So yeah, I'm sorry to hear about that diagnosis. I understand. My wife was diagnosed with asthma later in life too, and hasn't had an ICU incident yet, but it is scary. So I do understand the impacts of air quality and the work that we do. You do mention going to our website in terms of planning your daily activities. We actually, it's not on our app yet, but it's now available on our website. We just developed kind of an hour-by-hour forecast. So in the past, hopefully you've seen that. So in the past, you could look to the next day to see essentially what the worst hour was going to be, and you didn't know what hour it was. It was just that you just got the notice for the whole day. So now you can actually see hour by hour when air quality would be worse. And if you want to plan your day by exercising in the morning or going outside in the morning versus the afternoon when ozone is worse, you have that feedback. So that's an improvement we just made, and soon it'll be more readily available on the app as well. And you mentioned the uptick over in 2016, 2017. Yes, we recognize that. I will say that 2018 was better. 2019 even looks even better than 2018, although this last week has not been good, if you've been looking, right? So this was our first really warm week. You saw the high ozone levels, but we're still ahead of last year, which was better. So hopefully that turns out to be an anomaly for 2016, 2017. Emissions continue to drop. We can't control the weather year to year or day to day, unfortunately, but hopefully we're back on track. So we'll just see how the ozone season plays out. One of the realities that we're all faced with these short deadlines in 2023 is that you could blame us for not passing regulations decades ago or a decade ago, and we're subject to that criticism. But today, looking forward in just 4 years, there's really a big limit to what regulations can do. There's some stationary source regulations, yes, can be implemented in 2 or 3 years at best. The mobile source regulations, tailpipe standards take years to realize the benefits. There's just some limitations and some statutory limitations on how fast you can set those standards and how quickly they take effect. So we are committed, I think both agencies are committed to do as much in the short term as possible, but there's just a limit on how much we can get through regulation. So that's why incentives really become the only avenue to get to these goals. It was true when we were developing the 2016. It is even more true today. And so what we hope to do as part of this process is a more thorough accounting of exactly what we need to do, and you mentioned the near zero, you said we don't have time for near zero, so we just need to go right to zero. And from our perspective, we all want to go to zero eventually, but that statement is hard to reconcile with the fact that if we are going to zero, we actually do have to wait. We do have to wait. There is no trucks, zero emission trucks readily available that could be widely deployed today. There are 90% cleaner trucks that can be deployed today. Maybe the zero emission trucks are 3 years behind, 2 years behind, whatever it is, but we need to come to terms with this idea. If we want the quick reductions, we may have a period where we need to not go to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and get some early reductions for the people who are suffering the types of health impacts you mentioned. It won't be forever. We think there's still time for zero to come online. This is something maybe this group can wrestle with a little bit, but it is a big issue at the CARB level, at our level. I know the communities are really pushing for zero. We all agree we should get there. But if we're talking 2023, 2025, if we skip over that generation of technology, we are going to lose health benefits. There's no way around it. I think that covered a lot of what you said. Again, I don't want it to be just one way, or two way. If we can have a discussion, we could follow up later if you want to follow up on any of that. But we'll move on to some others. Rita. Where's Rita Loof? Hi, Rita.
Good afternoon, Rita Louv, Director of Environmental Affairs for RADTEC International. And I just had a quick question on Sarah's presentation on slide 28, where you mentioned the development of new incentive programs, and then you have a bullet for stationary sources. Could you elaborate on what kind of incentives you were thinking of for stationary sources?
Yeah, so there's a couple of developments there. So traditionally, we haven't done a lot of stationary source incentive programs. They've mostly been focused on mobile sources. As part of the 2016 AQMP process, we have some measures in there and identified some areas where we think we can find stationary source measures that are at least more or less equivalent to mobile source measures, incentive measures, in terms of being cost effective. And we found a few. So the first thing we did is we had almost $60 million in special funds that the district had that are intended either for mitigation or from settlements, but all with different restrictions, but generally intended for incentive programs to get emission reductions. And they could be mobile, they could be stationary. So we went to our board and proposed 23 or so projects, most of which were actually stationary source, which was relatively new for us. So we really got our feet wet with this set of projects and trying to do these stationary source incentive measures. Some are direct kind of deployment measures, but some are more technology development. And again, just trying to get our feet wet in some good stationary source measures. There's a lot in the residential and commercial equipment space. Another opportunity that has arose is with AB 617, which is the state law passed in 2017 that really focuses our efforts on community air quality and community exposure in our disadvantaged communities. The legislature has put aside approximately $250 million a year for incentive-type programs in those disadvantaged communities for hopefully 3 years now, 2 for sure, maybe a third year. The district's getting between 80 and 100 or so million of that that we will be spending on incentive programs. The first year was pretty limited to Carl Moyer 1B type programs. The second year, which we're just getting into now, has a specific provisions and has opened up to use it for stationary source measures. So CARB is working on some guidelines of the types of stationary source measures that could be funded with that. We have now some experience, so there will be an active process going forward to try to expand our incentive programs in that area. And I know we have an ongoing dialogue of the types of incentive programs that can help the industries that you represent and work with.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
All right, Todd. Did I sound enthusiastic about your testimony?
I was going to say, I hope that's a good intonation, showing your excitement for me to speak. You probably, I don't know if you saw me on Wednesday, giving testimony for the HFIP recommended changes. It was rather impassioned. But I'm going to give you praise because I think you actually spoke a lot of truth just a minute ago in saying we can't wait. And we can't wait to get reductions from some of our biggest sources, and our biggest sources really heavy-duty trucks. There's no way about it. If we're going to meet attainment, we need to get to it now. And that's why on Wednesday, poor Peter Christensen, I love the guy, but I had to kind of weigh in and say, removing near zero technology or low NOx trucks from the heavy duty or the HFIP program is wrong way for the state, and it's wrong way LA. That is a commercial ready strategy right now that not only reduces emissions 90% from what diesels are certified today, but in the in-use testing at UC Riverside, they're really coming out at 90% below that new certified optional low NOx standard, which, by the way, is the most stringent standard. I even suggested to Cummins Westport, they should really see if ARB will give us a new optional low NOx level and see if we could certify to that. Because, really, we need the lowest emitting technologies possible if we ever have a hope to meet attainment. It's just, we need them. And that is why it's so disappointing when we talk about the development of the low NOx standards. I know that Air Resources Board is trying to get new engine standards put in place as soon as possible. The politics aren't on our side. Even as fast as you move, we're still going to need a waiver, and it's going to be really interesting to see how the elections turn out. And who knows? Maybe we get it, maybe we don't. But that's already leading to a potential delay even of our state standards, I think, to possibly 2025. And I think EPA is already looking at maybe not having a new standard till model year 2027 for low NOx. That is really bad news for breathers in this basin. It's bad news for everyone's kids. The woman who just spoke, and for mine. It makes me really sad that that politics potentially could get in the way of some of the good work that's being done here in the state. But to go back on the HFIP program and some other programs, including the Energy Commission's consideration of potentially moving away just to go to zero, that is really, really bad policy for us, because we need to embrace everything we can get our hands on right now to address the mobile source sector, and especially the districts. I was very proud for Naveen Berry's testimony asking for Peter Christensen and his team not to remove the near zero category, or the low NOx category, as well as the San Joaquin Valley, who also is probably struggling a little even more with heavy-duty trucks, if that's possible. We just cannot go in that direction. We need tangible reductions now. And then I just want to say two more things. I think the last time I looked at the SIP, and it's been a while, it's been 2016, so I think it relies on 900,000 low NOx trucks by 2030 statewide. And I think this basin needs a minimum of 265,000 low NOx trucks, I think as soon as 2023. We're way off pace. And I think you're absolutely right, Phil. We do need zero-emission technology, and I think we need to invest in zero-emission technology. But the reality of us getting a sizable fleet, even in one location, we've been talking to our customers that actually have considered putting in trucks at one facility. They wanted to do 20 trucks. And the power that they needed was for 40,000 homes, and the utility said, we can't do it. So what does that mean? That means that you have a scenario where if you take away funding and people no longer have, or fleets no longer have a decision to make the best choice possible, that means you're going to have diesel. Diesel wins. That's what I said on Wednesday. Diesel will win. And by the way, when UC Riverside does the in-use testing, or actually when the Air Resources Board did the in-use testing, the emissions were 9 times above the certification standard from 2010 for diesel. That is the wrong way to go. That's not helping us. And it's primarily because of the selective catalytic reduction units in the engine that are not getting to a fast-paced level, or they're not hitting the speeds necessary to get the heat reductions and to get the mechanism working. So you have actually elevated emissions from these trucks. And that's the default. That's what we have to avoid. We need to get help ASAP, not just to, basin-wide, but especially to the disadvantaged communities. And finally, we did some polling because we're very interested in what you need to help you get to a solution, not just in 2023 and 2031. And we want to help the district, and we want to help the state, quite frankly, to get more funds to help get cleaner trucks on the road, in addition to other mitigation measures. And when we poll disadvantaged communities, people want solutions. They want cost effectiveness, and they want their families healthy. And at the end of the day, they don't care how you do it. So I think that we really need to think about when we do mandates like the Innovative Clean Transit Rule, and we promise transit agencies that if you go with us, we'll allow you to get HFIP funding, even though you're required under the rule, which is a new one for me. The consequences are you'll be spending a lot of money on fleets that are already incredibly clean. All you had to do was move those transit buses to low NOx engines and put biomethane into those facilities. And now we're finding ourselves in a very big, deep hole, which is going to pull away money from this district and the San Joaquin and the 7 other districts that are in the top 10, the 9 districts that are in the top 10 worst air districts or air basins in the country, right here in California. So as you look at your revisions, I just ask you to think strategically, not put your eggs in all in one basket at the state level. Work with the districts, please. Let's be innovative. Let's look at the indirect source rules. Let's try to make them the best we possibly can. We know we're going to get sued. We're going to get sued no matter what. But let's go down doing our best and trying to make sure that people have clean air in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Did you want to? I'll have something to add after Kurt.
Thank you, Todd. And I heard about your passionate speech at the testimony, I should say. I shouldn't have said speech, I apologize, on Wednesday. I actually do think there is going to be a healthy discussion in the context of producing the submittal for the end of the year about the issue of low NOx versus zero. I do need to push back a little bit. As we talk to particularly disadvantaged communities, you are right. They want solutions, they want clean air. And in the same sentence, as we heard in the prior testimony, they want zero emissions. And so it is incumbent on all of us to figure out how we're going to balance that. The other point I want to make is it is not, we have to be thinking broadly about the air quality and climate goals that we're dealing with and we're striving toward. And part of the investment, as you know, on zero emission technologies is to ensure that that gets developed. So just like you're saying for the market for your product, you know, if the money dries up, there's less market for your product. The other argument has to be made as well, that if we're not investing appropriately into zero emission technology, we're not going to see that develop, and it's going to be even further off than what we are seeing on the horizon now.
Thanks, Garrett. So, again, I agree with everybody, and I think the reason I can do that is because we need to get away from this either or. There's 500,000 trucks, and unless we're miracle workers up here, we're not going to change them all out in a year. So, you know, even if we changed out, you know, a good fraction to near zero natural gas in the next few years, there's going to be a lot more that can also be changed to zero emission when that is available, even if it's 6 months from now. And by the time you'd ever get close to 100% of the fleet being changed out, those natural gas trucks we fund today will already be at the end of their useful life. So you don't have to worry about that. There's other issues, the infrastructure issues we could talk about, the you know, the investments. We're all for the investments to push zero, but right now the investments to push near zero are just about incentives to get people to buy the truck, not infrastructure, not technology development, or a lot less than it is for the electric. But it's not either or, and we need to get past the political debate and get into the technical and policy-related debate of what is the pathway that maximizes benefits. Okay, Peter Herzog.
Good afternoon, Peter Herzog with NAP, the Commercial Real Estate Development Association, and I want to thank all of you for putting on the presentation and starting to lay out some real facts as opposed to some of the things you read in the newspapers. And also, there have been presentations lately to the Mobile Source Committee, also what was going on with PM, and what all the data shows is that while we still have more to do, and nobody's denying that, the emissions are continuing to decrease and will continue to do so in the future. Probably not as fast as anybody wants, but the trajectory is there, the trajectory will continue, and everyone is looking forward to working, I think, collaboratively to continue that trend on the best path possible. As Phil has mentioned, there's obviously a huge amount of complications, difficulties, on and on and on. I think all of us wish we could snap our fingers. We all have hopes and dreams. I know I do, and most of them aren't going to come true. But I think if, continuing to work together, we can, continue to move this path forward on decreasing emissions. And I also want to indicate that, as I said, I appreciate the facts coming out, sort of indicating, where the source categories are. And it's interesting on the type of emitters, since trucks were mentioned, it also indicates who's been the biggest contributor to decreasing NOx emissions. According to the chart you just put up, that between 2012 and 2023, the truck's NOx emissions will drop 70%. That's just in 9 years. And there's a lot more that's gone on and will continue to go on in that category that's already in place. And obviously, as you've laid out, will continue to be worked on, like the new engine standard, which would cut it another 90%, essentially getting it almost zero, certainly near zero, and on and on and on. I just had a couple of clarifying questions on chart 22, where it showed NOx emissions trends for heavy-duty vehicles. You had a 79%, and I was just trying to figure out which year that was. I don't know if that's 2020, 2021, or which year, because then after that arrow, then there's also obviously a pretty decent decrease after that. So I was just trying to find out.
Yeah, the 79% is from 1997. So from the time that the standard was adopted to 2023.
Oh,
that's
right.
anticipated.
Yeah, I understood that part. I just didn't know, because where the arrow is, I can't tell if that's 79% by 2020 or 2021, because then the line continues after that.
That's in 2023, yeah. It's just the way where the box is
Okay,
situated.
so that's for 2022.
2023.
Oh, 2023.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
That big
It's just-
downtick between 2022 and 2023 is full implementation of the truck and bus rule by CARB. That's why
Right.
you get that benefit.
Okay, so the 79% is actually 2023. Fine. Just move the arrow over a little.
It's just
Not a big deal. And then on slide 24, where you kind of, well, it's entitled Contribution to Federal Sources. On the left side, you have a section that says California on-road and California off-road. So I take it then those are the parts that are under CARB's jurisdiction and authority? Both those two sections?
That's correct. I think the distinction between that and the California on-road mobile sources for heavy-duty trucks and split between out-of-state trucks and California trucks.
Right. And so then there's the section for stationary services. That's the area where the local South Coast Air Quality Management District has jurisdiction. Okay, just wanted to make sure I understood your pie chart and where that goes. So thank you very much.
More cards. All right, Dave Rothbart.
Good afternoon, David Rothbart, representing the Southern California Alliance of Publicly Owned Treatment Works. There you go. I think everyone who's been involved in this for a while for the AQMP, we all know the sources that we need to control to get to attainment are the mobile sources and federal sources, and at least in the plan that we all worked on, we said we needed to incentivize the funding to get those technologies to market as soon as possible. And if we were to get the $2 billion a year, and I appreciate your comments, Phil, it sounds like even if you had all the money in the world, you're not going to get enough of that equipment on the road as quickly as possible, or to get to the attainment standard.
I'm just wondering if I said it in that way, but
you probably couldn't. I'm paraphrasing. But sort of my point is, even if you were to do everything physically possible, isn't it a major problem of what's coming in from out of state, and that we don't have the ability to have a federal standard that's going to get you down to the level you need to get to attainment? Isn't that kind of the critical path?
That's a challenge for the incentive programs. Assuming we're going to achieve the
Right.
reductions through incentive programs, it's much easier to incentivize trucks that either spend most of their time or all their time or are registered in California. It doesn't mean you can't incentivize some interstate trucking, but you need some guarantee they're going to visit here. Just like trains, as we have some guarantee they're going to continue to visit here. Less cost effective because some of those emission reductions we don't see the benefit of. So there is some opportunities there, but it's much more difficult. So you're right, and even if there was a federal standard, we think it will be helpful for, the timing is tough because even if the fastest schedule they would ever be able to do it legally is basically come out with a rule in 2020 and implement by 2024, which that is probably unlikely at this point. And then that's just for new sales of trucks, and it's going to take 12, 15 years before the fleet turns over again and you see the benefits. CARB has authority over all the trucks on the road in California, so with some limitations that the legislature just put on them with SB 1. So there's all those challenges exist on the regulatory front and on the incentive front, but there's enough in-state emissions that we still can address through incentives that we can get the emission reductions we need for attainment.
So you think with everything aligning, you could actually get to attainment in 2023?
Well, I think I could lay out these are the key questions, right? So I think you could lay out a pathway, which we will do, and say, look, this equipment can be changed, and this is how much it would cost, and we would get the reductions we need. And those will be big numbers, both in terms of numbers of equipment and dollars. Can we find willing partners to participate in those incentives and let those contracts? Do we have the capacity to build that equipment with the equipment manufacturers? Those are open questions we're not going to be able to answer right away or even in this process, but we need to start thinking about that as well. But in terms of laying out a pathway where we know that technologies are out there that can get us there, it's just how do you get them deployed?
At least as I think everyone understands that South Coast CARB has done everything possible. The emission reductions you've achieved is very impressive. There's not a lot left other than mobile and federal sources that could come down. And really my point here is the consequence of not getting to attainment is a concern I have upon stationary sources, highway funding, et cetera. And as far as putting a plan together by the end of the year, I do want to start thinking about teeing up the contingency and at least making a case for why these penalties should not be applied if you can't make it, because you've done everything you possibly can.
Right. We're looking at every option available to us in terms of this submittal. It is a short period of time. It's going to be difficult. We didn't mean to downplay the challenge. It is an enormous challenge to specify another 80 to 90 tons a day of emission reductions to be achieved in 3 years. So it is significant, and the sanctions are significant. And we'll get into the details in subsequent meetings, or if anyone has questions today. But we don't mean to downplay the severity of the situation we're all facing.
Thank you.
Okay, Bill, Lamar.
Sorry, I was talking to my cut man over here. So, hi, I'm Bill Lamar. I'm the Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance. And I'm sitting here listening to the previous speakers. Certainly Todd hit on a lot of points. I guess before I say anything, I should maybe, in the effort for have full disclosure, I was born in Los Angeles, as a matter of fact. We're an endangered species, Angelinos. I am a veteran, an asthmatic. I carry an emergency inhaler for emergency purposes. I'm a cancer survivor, neither of which was a result of air pollution, and a veteran. And I just celebrated my 80th birthday. I remember when the term smog was first coined, and I remember when we took it on faith that there was such a thing as San Gabriel Mountains and everything. So anyway, having said that, what bothers me, a number of things, having been a part of any number of AQMP working groups, and having sat through 3 or 4 MATE studies, I'm continuing to be impressed by the work that this agency has done. I can't always say that, Phil, and I haven't, but I am, because stationary sources have stepped up to the plate time after time, decade after decade. Your own pie chart here, you have CARB is responsible for 49% of the sources. And federal sources, the feds are 32%. You could shut down every stationary source on Monday, and you'd still be no closer to our attainment goals than you are today. Yet, AQMP after AQMP, it's stationary sources that are asked or demanded to step up to the plate and make further reductions. It wasn't until the last AQMP that, in my opinion, CARB finally stood up and accepted some responsibility for this, and guaranteed some of the emission reductions that were assigned to this basin. But we need to do more. I understand that you come up with $1 billion, maybe $2 billion in incentives, but I don't know why a single source agency like South Coast accepts the responsibility for that kind of money, regardless of how it's raised, through fees or through taxation or whatever it is, when the major responsibility is outside your jurisdiction. There needs to be more done. I was so glad to see that here that you're taking a tiered approach by going from possibly two zero emissions to near zero emissions first. The technology will come. Of course, it'll come in time. Not in time by the attainment dates that we have here in front of us, but I have seen, it's been 20 years since we founded the Alliance, Small Business Alliance. Trade association membership is at its lowest ebb ever. A lot of this is due to the Great Recession that we had, and then also to the severity of the regulations on stationary sources. It's not a matter of preference or anything like this for small businesses. More stringent controls and tighter or lower emission thresholds are significant expenditures to businesses. So businesses are just either leaving, shutting their doors forever, shedding their employees, and people are thrown out of jobs. Witness the rise in homelessness. This is a contributor, not the only one, but it is a contributor. So with this next AQMP, I hope that we would see more strategic thinking, a recognition that the burden for the 22 AQMP and subsequent AQMPs can't always fall on stationary sources. There has to be a more proactive approach by federal sources and state sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, for your comments. All right, Paul Ryan. It's been a while.
I haven't tried to abandon you yet. I've been overwhelmed with some of the issues at CARB as well as Cal Recycle. Today, I'm here representing the California Refuse Recycling Council, Southern District, as well as the Inland Empire Disposal Association. I look forward to working with you folks on the next AQMP and the difficult task we have in balancing interests for the future. My appeal today to you is one for the industry itself. It's going through a period between now and 2025 where we're dead center on the target. I just finished making 165 pages of comments on SB 1383, which is a game changer for the industry, as well as we're involved with 617, and we've been dialoguing with both you folks and ARB on the CTR regulations and so forth. The upshot of what I'm saying is we're going to have a tremendous difficult task within this time period, because certainly we had carryover items from the 2016 AQMP that we're going to have to reevaluate, as well as some of our fleet rules are coming up for reconsideration and so forth. And so from my vantage point, it's all coming together at the same time. Not only are we faced with changes, but then some of the regulations like 617, SB 617, AB 901, and so forth actually drive up VMTs and BTs and emissions, because now the rule is the state has more authority, they want us to do more, and so forth. And even as to date, some of the local associations are getting concerned with what's happening, and they're considering opening up their franchises and so forth. So my request today is if we can work out something for the waste industry because of this uncertainty of our times. We'd like to have a working group that starts pretty early because we do need to respond back, both you and I, on the CEQA documents for 1383 and some of the other things, because we're going to see growth-inducing impacts not only in air quality but other matters. And so if it's possible, I'd like to proceed with you folks in an early discussion period on some of the regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. And like every AQMP, we're happy to meet outside the advisory committee process with any industry or any group or any individual facility. So it sounds like, within the next few months, I'd like to hear more about the details of the challenges that industry is facing. I know some of it, not all of it. So when we're thinking of measures in a plan or rules that, we always consider all those other factors. We try. I'm sure other agencies always are as do that. But if we understand it, we could usually find a way to work around some of it and not put people in impossible situations.
This time around, we're going to have to focus our efforts because we still have carryover items from CalCOA on the emission factors and so forth for compost and others. And so I see it as timely that we either informally, well, I don't have any problem coming and bug you guys, so I'll be
Let's
at
set
your
something up,
doorstep.
absolutely. We should touch base, it's been a while, and we were
I'll make a
engaged
point.
in the composting issues several years ago. We have not lately, so we should get up to speed on that. as we
I'll
move.
make a point to get back to you right away because we really need to start something soon because we have a monumental task and it goes beyond just the mobile source issues.
All right, thank you. You can get in touch with Zoric and we'll set something up. Okay, so far all very familiar names. So Susan Stark.
Hi, Susan with Marathon. I had a question on slide 11 to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. Over on the 2023 side, it looks like, maybe it's an optical illusion, that the controlled bar is a little higher than the baseline. In other words, maybe a little extra controls, perhaps in the 182E5. Now, it may not be very much, but given that the CARB reductions since the AQMP, were 3 tons and the South Coast 5 tons, it might be worth it if I'm understanding the bars right. So
That's a good observation, and I could have answered that 2 years ago, but I'm going to
I know, it's like I saw this years ago.
There is an explanation. And
So.
I think the explanation is that we allocated a few tons, what we call set-aside account, SIP for what we call SIP set-aside account for like general conformity projects and a couple of other areas. So these are in excess of what we would need for attainment, essentially. So that's why you see about 5-6 ton difference in that.
And you're not doing that for 2031?
I think
it
there's
may
another
already be
factor in there, if I'm
included in
remembering
there,
right. There were, if you remember, the last few months of that AQMP, there were some inventory changes that changed one side of the equation or the other side of the equation.
Oh.
And I think that is reflected there. So we might not have changed the measures, but the inventory might have changed. But again, we still have a long way to go, so don't worry about over-control.
I'm just thinking that 3 to 5 tons is significant, given that that's, CARB got 3 tons, y'all got 5 tons in these couple of years.
So if we're lucky enough to get that close, and we're arguing
okay.
over whether we need this extra 3 or 5 tons a day, there's plenty of opportunities to go to EPA and tell them we're there without going beyond. So there were some last-minute things, and these are all carried over from there. If we ever get to that point, we can resolve it.
Okay.
Luis Portillo.
Good afternoon. My name is Luis Portillo. I'm with the Inland Empire Economic Partnership. So I just want to start by saying, first of all, commending you for earlier today, just recognizing the facts of some of the challenges you face, both in the ambitious levels of the goals that you need to meet, but also the available technologies that exist now in order to meet them. And I think that it really expresses a need that we must recognize that near zero emission vehicles need to be a critical part of this equation. You know, I grew up in San Bernardino, specifically in Muscoy. I work in Rancho Cucamonga, and not to push back, but most of those people in the communities don't really care about zero emission vehicles or near zero emission vehicles. They care about clean air. That's the fundamental. How you get there, that's on you. And so when I look at some of these reductions of the types of emissions that come from near zero emission, whether it's natural gas or other types of fuels, and you compare it to what was before, I think if you were to present that to someone and say, would you rather have this now or wait 10 years or 20 years for something better? The obvious answer is going to be to say, yes, get that now. Let's do it. And so I want us to make sure that we focus on that. And I think whenever some groups say no to near zero, it's essentially saying no to anybody having any improvements in clean air now at the expense of the now, in hopes that something perfect will emerge in the future. And even then, I think we still need to be considerate of the fact that while some of these technologies, they themselves are not zero, do not emit pollution, the power that generates them does. You know, still almost a third of the states in the United States get the majority of their power from coal. When that truck leaves California and it goes to Arizona and it's recharging from power that's generated from coal, is that really the most effective? It may work for us. Hey, during the time they charge here, that power is clean. But for the long term, for the overall health of our country, for the overall health of our planet, is that really the better approach? Whereas if you had a energy source that has a continual source that equal the same amount of pollution is going to come from it wherever it's provided, it's one of those areas where I think we need to be cognizant. You know, I think one of the things that we've always said is that California is responsible for 1% of the world's GHG emissions, and that's why we really need to be an example of how you can do this, how you can really protect your environment and still have a vibrant economy. I think if we can show, look, you have a massive amount of population, the Inland Empire, one of the largest distribution hubs in the world that's quickly developing. If we can show that we can still have a vibrant economy and we can still have clean air, you know, have the cleanest fleet in the country, I think that's something to be proud of. I'd rather not say, you know what, no, if it's not all electric or it's not all zero emission. We need to really recognize the progress that has been made. And I really commend you for some of these charts because it's really startling how effective, AQMD and the state has really been in really making significant improvements to our air quality over the past 30 years. The other point I just want to emphasize is, we heard it a little bit earlier today, which is the need to really focus incentives on the areas that have the most impact. Doesn't make sense replacing a truck that's 5 years old. It makes sense replacing a truck that's 20 years old. It makes sense, and so to the extent that we can start looking at some of these sources of pollution and then determining which are the most cost effective. And just one example in my mind, something I think of just because it's kind of where issue I dealt with before is the power source from California is continually getting cleaner. By 2040, it's going to be zero emission or zero carbon. So any type of expenditure you say you do with energy efficiency, great. If I get you to reduce your energy usage by 25% and I pay you $30,000 to do that, well, how much have GHG emissions have we really taken out of the air? How much NOx emissions have we really taken out of the air? Whereas if we had used that $25,000 to get an old truck off the road, get somebody into a electric car, that's a more significant. And so to the extent that we can look at prioritize funding for incentive programs to those areas where they would have the most tangible effects in reducing NOx emissions, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I think those are the best, the most effective way, because I think people do want to see it. People want to see tangible, measurable benefits in the short term, not 10 years from now, not 20 years from now. And so to the extent we can do that and focus in those areas where it'd be most effective, I would really hope you take that approach. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. On that last point, we are beginning the exercise that will be part, we think, of this submittal on the incentive side to really take another deep dive into how we best apply incentive money on a kind of a finer scale than was done in the previous AQMP, where we can really look at equipment age and life and really target the ones that are really cost effective. And we think we'll actually, the $1 billion a year or more, whatever it's going to be, we can shave a little bit off of that if we're a little smarter about how we target things. But we're going to be going through this process in the next couple months to build a bit of a model that helps us explore some of those things and get a better handle on that need. And then if the money was raised, how it would be spent. I think there's no more cards, but I think we got something from the interweb. Does slide 25 indicate that the CARB shore power rule has not contributed significantly to the needed reductions?
Maybe I can comment on that, and maybe Sylvia or Kurt can also add. All the adopted and existing regulations are reflected in this chart. So I think maybe what you're seeing here, I think when the ADPER regulation started taking effect in 2014 by requiring 50% of certain vessel classes to either shore power or use alternative technologies. So that regulation took effect at that time. But I think what you might be seeing here is that some of that benefit may have been offset by the growth that was actually achieved or actually reflected in the OGV category. So I think there's a couple of factors that are going at the same time here. But the benefit of the ADPER regulations is reflected, which actually requires 80% of these vessel classes, container ships, reefers, and cruise ships to basically either use shore power or alternative technologies for 80% of their calls. But there's definite growth that is offsetting some of that.
Zorik is exactly right on that's what's going on with the category we're looking at, the ships in the slide on 25. That growth paradigm actually exists for all of the sectors that we're looking at. The challenges with ships is it's difficult to get at those. Our control programs aren't as mature for ships as they are, say, for light-duty vehicles, where a car today is 99.9% cleaner than a car 50 years ago. I do, though, want to add, as Zorik's right, 2014 is the existing rule. We are in the middle of rulemaking now, and we'll be going to our board in December of this year. That's our scheduled board hearing for a revision to the shore power rule, trying to get past the 80% number and get more ship types that Zorik was listing. For those, one other thing, for those who want to be there, that December meeting will be in Oakland, by the way, not in Sacramento.
So the shore power rule has achieved reductions and will achieve even more with the revision. The vessel speed reduction at the ports has been a really good emission reduction strategy. It's voluntary, but it has high levels of participation. And then we are, many of you know, we've been really kicking off a process to do some work on the technology side on the ships for when, not just at shore, but when they're in transit or at anchor, in terms of the technology and what kind of retrofits can be done actually on board, as well as trying to find international partners for incentive programs so we can encourage either the installation of that equipment or the cleaner Tier 3 vessels to visit our ports. And actually, it's a daunting task to do this type of international work, but we've actually have a lot of enthusiasm from a lot of the entities in Taiwan and China that we've talked to. So we're pretty encouraged so far. It takes time, but we hope to realize some benefits in the next few years from that effort. I have no more cards, is that correct?
I just want to do a quick reminder to folks who are listening in, if you have a question you would like to email into us, the address again is aqmpteam@aqmd.gov. So if you have any of those questions, please send them along.
But I will, whether you have a card in or not, I'll open it up if anyone additionally wants to speak. Yes. I'll just have to take turns.
Sorry, I didn't get a card in. Eric Neandros with GNA. Interesting discussion, and like you, Phil, I agree with everyone, except for one thing, and that's the first comment. We've done a lot of work on near zero and zero emissions, and really looking at the cost effectiveness of the investment, I think, is critical, and I'm glad to hear that you guys are going to take a deeper dive look at this, because when we hear comments about don't do near zero, ironically, after talking about health impacts of pollution, I scratch my head and I think we can get so much more done with the limited money we have, and you showed that we don't have enough money. And I would so much rather see the Sierra Club and the EJ community fight with us to try to identify more money to do all of the above, because we have to do all of the above. All of these technologies have to be wildly successful, beyond our greatest dreams, for us to get clean air. And we have to look strategically. And I've got a graphic. I don't know, can I put this up? I got a really fancy system here. We did some work. This is a couple years old, and probably the data could be refreshed a little bit. But this shows, if you had $500 million to spend, how do you get the most bang for the buck? And what it shows is if you invest that in near zero or zero, you get 4 times the number of units on the road. You get 3 times the amount of NOx reductions. Not to say don't do zero, or not to invest in zero. We have to invest in zero too. We want that to work. But if we're talking about short-term public health crisis, people getting sick and going to the hospital, people dying, we have the ability to chip away at that problem. And to say don't administer the cure, to me, is irrational and is crazy. And I'm really, really happy to hear, Phil, your comments earlier that this is part of the strategy that we have to employ. And I would urge you all to take that message out into the communities. I know that the communities want zero, but honestly, I'm not sure they understand the data. The first comment the woman said, well, now I'm going to read the comments that were given to me. I'm not convinced she sees what the data says and how that all relates to her own personal health struggles. And I think we have to take a look at that. Again, we have to do all the above. I'm not saying do one or the other. We need more money. It's really what it comes down to. We have to get that $1 billion. And if we could all lock arms and fight for that, I think we'd make more progress than trying to fight within the different panaceas that we're trying to apply here. So I just wanted to show that as work that we've done. I think it's important that we think about what we're trying to achieve here. Are we trying to achieve clean air or something else? So thank you for your time.
All right, thanks. Andy?
Back on what he said, I was at the Andy Sill, County San Bernardino, and board consultant to board member Janice Rutherford. I was at the AB 617 meeting last night, and we do have very vocal members of the environmental justice community who are zero only, zero only, zero only. Information is a powerful thing. Joe Impaluti gave a presentation on the state of the various technologies, and by the end of that presentation, I think he had actually changed some minds, because one of our community members who's been most vocal about zero only, she was very impressed, and the last thing she said was, you need to give that presentation at every meeting we have. Because once they saw chapter and verse where the various technologies are, the lights started to come on, that, zero emission, long haul, heavy duty is way down the road, but we can make these improvements in the near term. So Joe, and along with Naveen, were kind of the secret weapon for changing that narrative you hear from the EJ community that zero only. I think they were impressed and very informed, and I think it might have changed some minds.
All right, thanks for that. Yeah, I think it's just a matter of being able to figure out how to have the dialogue in a way that's not, such a debate. I mean, there's a lot of information we got to get out there, and people shouldn't be taking sides on this issue. All right. Any other?
We just realized that we have a problem with our email address, so that folks who are trying to email us who are not on an approved list are having their emails kicked back. So in the event there's someone listening in who would like to send us a question, you can use my email, which is srees@aqmd.gov, and we'll be happy to respond to that.
So this one's no good?
Yeah, it's good if you're on an approved list, apparently, or a district employee, but it's kicking back other emails.
Okay, we have another card. Alex?
Yeah.
Just introduce yourself, then I don't have to say it.
My name is Alex Spadaber. I'm with the Adept Group and Engineering Company in Los Angeles, California. This has to do with a port situation, and it has to do with the fact that it has come to my attention through some classes that I teach at UCLA that some of the credits that have been taken for clean air, in fact, are not real. And the question has to do with ocean-going vessels who are currently assumed under the current models to be complying with existing rules and regulations under the sulfur rule. The reality is that they're not, okay? And it's a double-edged sword in that, number one, credits that are being considered as real are not, and because they're not known, there's the additional problem that we're not doing anything about it because we assume them not to be there. And this has to do with a sulfur rule currently that's used in California, the 24 nautical mile sulfur rule. And I have no idea how much time I have to speak because I can speak to it for about a half an hour, but I will not do so.
There's no limit,
so
but
somebody has to raise
something less than a half an hour.
Somebody has to raise their hand when I have a minute or so to go, okay? Because what we're dealing with here is a situation where ships coming into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach or leaving the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach can illegally consume fuels that are more than 0.1% sulfur in content. As such, they produce SOx and particulate matter and NOx that currently are considered to be not there. In fact, they are there, and these are the kind of pollutants that have very short lives and as such have a much higher impact on the disadvantaged communities in and around the ports. And if there's an interest here at the board to learn more about it, we'd be happy to share that information with you, but this only came to us over the last month or so. This is a class that, some work that we've been doing at UCLA. So I don't know what to do with this information at this point. There is some technology in Europe currently that is available to monitor using drones and aerial monitors to determine whether or not OGV are complying with such requirements. And they've been very efficient in finding out who does or does not comply. And what you currently have in Europe, and particularly Northern Europe and then in the North Sea and the Baltic, as well as in the Channel, you have documented cheating to the tune of 10%. That is significant considering that, in fact, they know that there is monitoring in place, and there's no monitoring in place here in Los Angeles or in South Coast or in Oakland for that matter. So if there's interest to follow that up, I'll be happy to follow that up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think staff at AQMD has met with you with some of the technologies you're talking about. I'm not familiar of any tie-in to any of the credit systems that we use for NOx or some of the other pollutants here on the stationary source side, and a compliance rate for a low sulfur rule. It's a CARB rule for ships, a certain distance out. And I don't have the details of the compliance rates for the low sulfur rule, but
from what I understand, actually, this question came up a couple of weeks ago, and I think we contacted CARB staff, and they mentioned the compliance rate for CARB's low sulfur regulation is 97% in 2018, so I'm a little bit surprised to hear what you
To
said.
be blunt about it, that's BS. I'll tell you why, because simply put, the difference, the incentive is to cheat. You have over $200 difference per ton between clean diesel and dirty diesel, number one. Number two, you have, there's documented that if in fact, the way CARB enforces these rules, because they're limited in the way they can do so by staff and by equipment, they only do so at peer, and they do so randomly. As such, their probability of hitting somebody who cheats is very low, even though you're dealing with clearly in excess with 10% of cheating. So using the number of people that they caught as a compliance number is in fact wrong, okay? So why is that a credit, to answer your question earlier? Because the current models models used by AQMD take into account, consider that the ships are in fact complying with this rule, and they're not. So the current models that you use for what is clean and what is not, they're incorrect.
So if you have any evidence of a lower compliance rate you want to share, I'm sure CARB staff would love to see it. We're always interested in new technology that would help get compliance rates up or identify violations. I'm familiar with your technology. I'm very familiar with using it in Hong Kong. I'm familiar with those researchers. So again, it's a CARB rule, and it's the compliance with that rule is a CARB responsibility. We're willing to help. We just, I think you need to work through with CARB staff who's responsible for the compliance with that rule and see if any of the tools you're mentioning would be helpful to them. But
Have you been in contact with CARB's enforcement division?
Yes, we've been in contact with CARB Enforcement Division. We conducted presentations with CARB. And it's, even though it's a CARB rule, there are MOUs between AQMD and CARB as far as handling things like truck compliance and things of that sort. I don't see why there shouldn't be that same kind of coordination between AQMD as well as CARB. CARB is simply limited by what it can do, and we're dealing with our air district here. And as such, it's something that should be of concern to the district.
Right. I mean, non-compliance would be a concern. We have limited resources, as does CARB, to do these inspections. But again, I think there's been an ongoing dialogue. I mean, again, evidence of non-compliance that's not being caught is something we're all interested in. So just saying there's incentives to cheat, therefore it's BS that there's a certain compliance rate. We need to start talking about like what evidence you've actually seen of that or have of that. But if it's true, it needs to be fixed. We're all ears.
Well, the point is that there is technology to fix it. And there's very good reason to believe that, in fact, there's cheating in excess of the numbers that are currently being applied. And even though there is some cheating, the current models that AQMD uses take into account there's no cheating at all, which is incorrect.
Okay,
Anyway,
thanks.
Thank you for your time.
Anyone else would like to speak? That's it. Okay, so thanks everyone for your time. I think, as you all know, many of you know, some of you have been asked to be on the AQMP advisory group. That list is going to be going to hopefully to our committee on next Friday, and then to our full board in September. So after September, when the board approves the full rosters, we will kick off our typical AQMP advisory group, so we'll be scheduling that for sometime in September, and then probably monthly till the end of the year, and then moving into the 2022 AQMP, we'll take stock of how often we need to meet and where we are. So if there's no other questions, anything else online?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, if you were not able to submit comments or questions online, please submit them after this meeting to either myself, Sarah, or Phil, or Barbara, or any one of us, and we'd be happy to address your comments.
Make sure you signed in, whether you're on the group or not, just in case there's somebody else that we can keep informed of all the activities. Everyone who signs in and leaves us an email will be notified of any activities in this area that we're undertaking. Kurt, did you have any final words? No? Okay. So with that, we'll call the meeting to a close. Thank you, everyone, and see you in September, and some of you sooner.